Regime after regime has fallen to the Arab Spring, but Syria's uprising has perhaps been the most complex and long-running. This week saw an uptick in violence and a promise from President Assad to rule with an iron fist. Access to Syria has been extremely limited, but CNN's Nick Robertson has found a way in. He joins me now from Damascus. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Fareed.
Let me start with the bottom line, Nick. It seems as though, in the case of Syria, repression has worked. The Syrians seem to have taken a page out of Tiananmen Square or something and just decided that they were going to meet all this protest in all these cities from large parts of the population with a pretty iron hand and just crush it, no real concessions. Has it really worked?
Perhaps if you take the Tiananmen example, it has. Tiananmen was successful at that square because the army backed what the government told it to do. And that's essentially been the success of Bashar al-Assad here, despite a small number of defections. And that was the weakness for the other revolutions in the region that we've seen, be it Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, etc. Bashar al-Assad still controls the army. He still controls the vast majority of the country. There are armed soldiers around key government buildings in the city. When he drives through the city to go to an event, you see civilian-clad, strong-looking men lining the road every few yards. Some of them are armed. He has a loyal security force that's been built up over essentially 4 decades through his father. So he is riding this out right now.
What does it feel like on the ground? Does it feel like you're in a country which has been, it was always a police state, but has been turned into almost an armed encampment? Is there a huge amount of security visible everywhere?
In Damascus, for example, it can feel almost like a Damascus at any time. The streets are busy. Most of the stores are open. There's a little less electricity than there used to be, but only fractionally less. For people in the capital, life goes on. But I was in Homs during the week, and there it feels like a city under siege. You go through a series of checkpoints to get into the city. There are areas of the city that the government doesn't control. You see soldiers riding around in trucks. Some parts of the city, life seems to be normal-ish. There are people on the streets. The stores are open. Other areas are completely deserted. The government wouldn't allow us to go towards those areas where the opposition is, so we don't know the transition, we don't know the disposition of forces, we don't know how the fighting takes place, if you will, along those fault lines. But for the most part, this country has gone from a police state, if you will, to a armed military state. Yet, I can say that, and you can drive all the way, takes almost 2 hours from Damascus to Homs, and not pass a single checkpoint on the highway. It's disconcerting in some ways.
And talk about the army. This is an army where the top generals are Alawite. Assad and his family come from this small minority sect, about 10% of the population. But the broader army, even down, the colonels must be Sunni, of the Sunni sect. Why are they sticking with this minority Alawite regime?
Perhaps because part of the problem that's led to the widespread revolt we're seeing here has an economic component, and those who are being financially rewarded by the regime don't see a purpose in revolting. And that's perhaps why the army maintains some loyalty. When you look at the soldiers here, they're relatively well equipped. It's not like looking at the army, for example, even in Egypt or in Libya. The soldiers here generally look better equipped, so one would imagine they're better paid. I was talking to to soldiers in the past week, soldiers in an army hospital who'd been injured. And these were people who said they were getting great treatment in hospital. You'd expect them to say that their families were able to come and see them, and they didn't seem to, and again, you wouldn't expect them to sit there and criticize the government, but this is an army that can support its members. There is an army hospital. There are large army bases. It's been an established and working institution in the country. It hasn't crumbled and lost its direction. Its direction has been maintained behind the leadership. Again, I think all these things contribute to why the army that's made up of Sunnis too has not defected to the opposition, because a large part of the discontent is the economy. It's the poorer areas often that you're seeing having the opposition and rising up angrily against the government.
You talk about how the Assad regime is taking care of the generals, probably the army in more broad terms. One of the things that's puzzled me is, where is the money coming from? Because this is not an oil-rich country. It doesn't have much international support. It has one ally, Iran, which is itself troubled. Is Iran the main answer, or is it that what little money there is all being funneled to the military?
I think probably the latter, that a large part of the money does find its way to the government, to loyalists. I mean, this is a country that's in a prime place to trade across its borders. One of its ports is a Mediterranean seaport, an important strategic Mediterranean seaport that the Russian Navy is allowed to use. So that's an important relationship as well. And that's an alliance that Russia is not going to want to lose access to that seaport in the Mediterranean. So you also see trade and business here. There are steel mills, there's mining. As the president told the nation just this week, we can sustain ourselves. And what he didn't explain is that if you're cut off by sanctions, trading with yourself does not an economy build. In fact, it leads to a spiraling downturn in the economy. But the country can sustain itself in terms of agricultural products. But it really does seem to be a case where the top 5% of the country, military, family, regime loyalists, have really creamed off the best of the money.
The Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan said that if Assad didn't leave, Syria was going to descend into civil war. Now, he has been urging Assad to leave. So I think that there was a political point to his statement. But does it strike you that Syria is descending into civil war on the ground there?
It's descending into a terrible stalemate that seems to have only one possible outcome. There are two sections of the community here, for and against the government, with a very tiny middle ground in between. And these two parts of the community are becoming increasingly polarized. And it seems hard to imagine, if this continues, as it seems set to, a stalemate where Assad can neither take control of opposition areas or put down this opposition, that these parts of the community will clash. It doesn't seem like a civil war at the moment. King Abdullah in Jordan said that Bashar al-Assad should step down, but the view in Jordan now seems to be rather that if there was a vacuum chaos because Assad came down rapidly and there wasn't a smooth transition of power, then that would have a negative impact on Jordan. So I think you're seeing the region also reevaluate its assessment of Syria. Turkey can perhaps afford to take a very strong line. It's a large, powerful, rich country. Jordan is a much smaller neighbor and would feel the repercussions of chaos here much sooner.
So we may be here for a while in this stalemate.
That's the impression that I get right now. What cataclysmic event could happen that would really turn the stage here? It would have to be the army changing its mind that it wasn't going to back the regime. That on the surface, as far as we see, doesn't seem to be on the cards. If you look at the president in the past week, speaking on national television, he hasn't done that for months and months and months, almost a 2-hour-long speech. The following day, appearing live at a rally in Damascus with his wife, unheard of. And this is a president who sort of seems to have found his feet. He talked in his speech about almost believing what he described as the lies of the interview conducted by ABC here a few months ago, himself almost believing it. And when you listen to him, this is a man who you get the impression is almost sort of saying, I was sort of down, but now I realize that was all lies, and I'm back on my feet and I'm coming back. This seems to be a man who's sort of on a political rebound. You could also look at the fact that he's changed the way that his family has done business here. That he comes out on a stage to greet his supporters, something that he hasn't done through this crisis. You could look at that and say, is that a moment of weakness? To me right now, it looks like he's found his footing. He knows after 10 months he hasn't lost the momentum. If the stalemate, if you will, the status quo, is essentially on his side. He is not slipping downhill. It's almost as if the onus right now is on the opposition to increase the gains that they've made, to take more territory, and to be able to increase and leverage that against him. And that doesn't appear to be the momentum on the ground. Having said that, we cannot get close to these sort of key areas where the opposition is strongest to make an assessment of the dynamic on the ground. In Homs, for example, we were there through a period of a day. We saw during that time, and you can imagine, we cannot see the whole city all the time. We just happened to come across 4 soldiers injured during the process of being in the city for about 8 hours. We were told 20 to 25 soldiers a day are wounded there. We can't verify that figure. But this, in some ways, looks like it could develop into a war of attrition, which the opposition, the onus on them is to maintain their weapons supplies. Otherwise, they won't be able to maintain their fight. And that's perhaps where Assad may have an advantage here.
Fascinating, important reporting. Nick Robertson, pleasure as always. Thank you so much.